All right, welcome back, class. This time we're going to do something a little different. So right now we're at Appomattox National Park, and fortunately it's not too far of a drive for me, but unfortunately it doesn't look like the weather's holding out too well for us. But anyways, we'll head on up, see what we can find. Thanks. All right, so here we are. Finally got out of the weather. The elements outside weren't really too good. So anyways, we moved inside. I've got Bob Muller here from Appomattox Courthouse National Park, and tell us a little bit about where we are and kind of what were the significant events that occurred in this very room that we're standing in.
Okay, right now we are standing in the parlor of Wilmer and Virginia McLean. They were the owners of this house. They moved here in the fall of 1863. And this kind of sets up why things are going to happen here. And we'll come back to that shortly. But this is the room where Lee and Grant will meet on the afternoon of April the 9th to discuss surrender terms. Lee has left the Petersburg-Richmond area. He's trying to get to North Carolina to join forces with Joseph Johnston, the Army of Tennessee. Johnston's being chased by Sherman. So Lee's hope is if they put the two armies together, they have a better chance. His original plan was to follow the Richmond-Danville Railroad down to North Carolina. He gets blocked on the railroad by Union troops, and so he's going to try to do a flanking movement. He's going to head westward and try to go around. Every time that happens, there's going to be another small engagement. The biggest one will be at Sailor's Creek, and it's there that Lee will lose 8,000 men. 7,000 of those will simply be prisoners. So when he gets to Farmville, the trains are waiting there with food. He gets some rations off the trains, and then the Union troops catch up again. So he sends the trains down the tracks to Appomattox Station, which is 3 miles to the west of us. And then he makes a fateful mistake. He crosses over the Appomattox River. He hopes by burning the bridges he can get ahead of the Union Army and reach safety. Unfortunately, he's not familiar with this part of Virginia. He doesn't realize that he now has the longer route to get here than the Union troops do.
Right.
So Grant will split his army. Meade and the Army of the Potomac are now chasing Lee. Sheridan, he's in command of the cavalry, the Army of the Shenandoah, is trying to get in front of Lee. That will happen down here on the afternoon of April the 8th at the train station.
And that's where it cuts off.
That's where
right?
troops under Custer will come in. They will capture the trains.
Okay.
There'll be a battle between the reserve artillery of Lee's army, who's out in front of the army. That will take place on the late afternoon, early evening of April the 8th. Custer's troops will eventually capture that position. They'll capture 25 artillery pieces, over 1,000 prisoners, and 100 wagons loaded with munitions. The Confederates that were there will retreat back to the village. Lee's army, the advance of it, is at the far end of the village, and then 4 miles back to the east to what was then called New Hope Church. And Meade is on the other side of him. Grant is with Meade up in that area. He's at a private home. He's staying there for the night, and then he gets word that Custer's troops have captured the trains. So what he will do on the morning of the 9th is he will leave there. He's going to make a big loop all the way around the Confederate Army to get down here. Lee is still going to try to break out. Even though he's lost the food, he's going to try to push out of here and continue getting to North Carolina. So he will send John Gordon down here with about 9,000 men. There'll be about 5,000 infantry, about 4,000 cavalry, and they will be lining up right here to the west of this house. The Union troops are up on the ridge to the west of us, up where the tree line is today. There's about 1,500 Union cavalry up there. And so when Gordon launches the assault, the Confederates start pushing that cavalry off to the south and southwest. And then it looks like things are going well for Lee. Gordon sends word back, the road's open, and then the Army of the James begins to arrive. That's another 25,000 Union infantry.
Wow.
15,000 of them will get here in time for the battle. And those men will march 30 miles in 21 hours to get here.
Wow.
So once they come into the battle, Gordon's going to send word back to Lee, my troops are fought to a frazzle. Unless Longstreet can support me, there's nothing more we can do here.
Right.
Longstreet's got the 1st and 3rd Corps back to the east. They're facing Meade, who's already forming men up for an assault. So Lee realizes there's nothing he can do anymore. 10 o'clock, the white flags go out.
Yeah.
He requests a meeting with General Grant. Grant will send word back. They find him on the road to the east of us. Grant sends word back, pick a place and I'll meet you there.
Yep.
So Lee is going to send Colonel Charles Marshall, one of his aides, into the village. He is going, when Marshall comes into the village, he says the only white gentleman he sees walking around is Wilmer McLean. And the reason for that is, like I started to allude to earlier, is the McLeans only moved here in the fall of '63.
Right.
They're not local people. The other people that live in this village have relatives elsewhere in the county, so when they hear the armies are coming this way, they flee. They know they will be traveling on this road.
Sure.
This is, we joke, this is the interstate highway of the 1800s
Okay.
between Lynchburg and Richmond.
Yeah.
And basically it was. So Marshall will meet McLean. He will ask, is there someplace we can use? This was originally built as a tavern. This was not a private home. Think of this as a small hotel. So there was another part out front, an old wooden building. That hasn't been used since '57 when this went out of business as a tavern. When Marshall has offered that, he says we can't use it. There's no furniture in or anything. So McLean's kind of stuck. He's standing in his front yard. The Union front line is right here alongside Mr. McLean's house. Behind his house and off to the, down to the east of us here by the old Wright cabin. And so McLean's kind of in a tough position. He says, okay, you can use my house. So they will send word back to Lee. Lee will get up here about 1 o'clock. Grant is still traveling. He comes in from the southwest here, over by the Rain Family Cemetery marker. He will get here about 1:30. He first comes in and chats personally with Lee a little bit. You have to remember both of these men are West Point graduates, even though they're 15 years apart.
Yep.
Served the United States Army
And so
prior to this war.
So if I remember correctly, Grant, he can recall Robert E. Lee. However, Robert E. Lee says, you know, I couldn't put your face, you know.
Yeah, I can't put a face. Yeah, I couldn't put a face to you.
Yeah, and then as far as like the clothing that they wore, what were some of the differences between Robert E. Lee versus Grant?
Grant, like I said, Grant has traveled about 20 some miles to get here. He's wearing just a basic uniform, just as his insignia on his collars. Lee has put on a brand new uniform.
Yeah.
And when his men asked him why he was putting on a new uniform the night before, he said, because tomorrow I may be General Grant's prisoner and I want to look appropriate.
Right.
So there is a big contrast between these two gentlemen in the room. Even though if you look at all the paintings, they never portray Grant looking that way.
Right.
So there'll be the other officers invited in. There'll be about 20 minutes of just socializing. And then Lee wants to get down to business.
Yeah.
So Lee was seated at the marble top table when Grant arrives. The small table is off to the corner there. They'll bring that table out for Grant to work at. He will sit there. He will write out a rough draft of the terms of surrender. Basically, everybody that surrenders here, and the way it works out within a 20-mile radius of this courthouse, they will be paroled until properly exchanged.
Right.
Which means they'll be free to go. They're not going to a prisoner of war camp. That was the main thing Lee was looking for his men.
Now, was that kind of uncommon, or is that something?
No, there have been paroles going on, especially earlier in the war. You have men who are captured. They're kind of put into a
they go like
facility.
A prison camp, right?
They go to a prison camp, or even when they get, sometimes they get, they'll be put into what they call exchange camps. And then, say you have 10 of mine, I have 10 of yours. We swap those 10, and now they're able to go back into the Army.
Right.
So this has been happening during the war. Eventually, they begin to realize all we're doing is just keeping the same people in the fight. So then they start putting them in the camps, and they kind of stop with the exchanges.
Okay.
So Grant did this at Vicksburg also. He paroled all the men at Vicksburg and let them march out. So that's what Lee wants to see. He wants his men able to go home.
And based off of some of their letters back and forth to each other, it seemed like they had talked about peace, and it seemed like Lee had kind of come in here knowing that he could potentially become a prisoner. However, the peace, agreements that they had, or through the letters that they had talked about, was is almost like he had kind of expected this outcome, right? Okay.
When Grant sends the first letter, he says, basically, due to what's happened the past few days, don't you realize your situation is hopeless? To prevent further effusion of blood, we should meet and end this. And Lee, when he gets the letter, he shows it to Longstreet, and Longstreet goes, not yet. So, so that's the first set of exchange. And then Lee kind of writes back, he goes, I would like to see, prevention of further effusion of blood also, but talking about peace, what are your terms going to be?
Yeah.
Lee is talking about peace, and Grant cannot establish peace.
Okay.
He was given orders by Abraham Lincoln that he can accept the surrender of Lee's army, but we can't do peace. That's up to the government to establish peace.
Okay.
In other words, establish the state governments again and so forth.
Right.
And that's kind of, so there's this.
This is kind of the first step before
Yeah,
we can get
Lee's talking peace, but Grant's talking surrender.
there. Okay.
So.
So now, I guess we can only speculate here, but what if those terms Grant proposed in those letters were slightly different? I mean, do you think, was there any chance of Lee fighting it out, or do you think he had kind of come to the conclusion that it was done?
Yeah. If Grant was going to send these men to a POW camp,
Yeah.
Lee would have walked out of the meeting,
Oh yeah.
gone back to his men, and the battle would have recommenced.
Okay.
Yeah,
Very well.
that's what he's looking for. But Longstreet, when he talks with Lee the night before, he says he's sure that Grant is going to parole everybody at this
Right.
point. That it's not going to be one of the unconditional surrenders such as it was at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry.
Okay.
That's where Grant gets his unconditional surrender name.
Right.
From Ulysses S. Grant, they changed it that way. And what a lot of people don't realize is Longstreet and Grant were best friends at West Point for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Longstreet was even Grant's best man at his wedding.
Oh wow.
So
Yeah.
Longstreet knows what Grant's going to be like. He tells Lee the terms will be favorable.
Right.
You can kind of count on that.
Okay.
So the men would be paroled. The officers allowed to keep their sidearms, their personal belongings, and their mounts. So when you hear these myths about Lee offering his sword and Grant refusing it and so forth, that's simply a myth. It was never asked for.
Right.
The Confederates have to submit 2 copies of a roster of everybody who's surrendering here.
Okay.
They do that by the company rosters. So you're going to have a stack of papers of all these various companies and units that turn in a list of names. Union Army gets 1 set, Confederate Army keeps 1 set.
Okay.
And those are still in existence. The Confederate copy is with the Museum of the Confederacy, which is now the American Civil War Museum. The Union copy is in the National Archives. And finally, all the war materials have to be surrendered. And here's one of the sticking points in this agreement. Grant is considering the horses and mules to be war materials because the federal government supplies those animals to the Union armies.
Right.
Lee says, in my army, the men bring these animals from home.
Yep.
And so once Grant agrees to let the men take the animals when they go, Lee will accept the terms. So the rough draft's given back over to Grant. He will have Ely Parker, who's a Seneca from upstate New York. He's Native American. He and Grant have become friends back in 1860 in Galena, Illinois. He will write out the terms in ink. Grant will sign those, give them over to Lee. Lee will have Marshall write a brief acceptance note. Lee will sign that and give that over to Grant. It's 3 o'clock. We're finished.
Well.
It's an hour and a half, the whole meeting.
Yeah. So what happened 3 days later, then on the 12th, out front of the
Okay, well, the way it works out, the surrender will take place over 3 days.
Okay.
That's the surrender of the arms. On the 10th, the cavalry will surrender their arms to the east of the village, down in the valley there by the river. On the 11th, it'll be the artillery's turn. But on the 12th, the infantry has to surrender their arms. And they are going to be required to come up and stack their arms right on this road.
Right.
So they will start down near Mr. Pierce's house, just a little past that. There'll be Union troops, about 5,200 of them, lining the road, both sides. From that area right up to where you get to the courthouse.
Right.
They split around the circle of the courthouse. Then it's a single file on this side of the road, down a little past Mr. McLean's house here.
Okay.
And so the Confederates are going to come up division by division to surrender their arms.
Now, is this a ceremonial type?
This is a ceremonial
okay.
type thing.
Right.
Chamberlain is in charge of this, Joshua Chamberlain, from Gettysburg fame.
Right.
He's in command of the Union troops. The Union troops have been sitting out there waiting for the Confederates to come. The Confederates are in no big rush. But if you go down to that site, you'll see they're coming up a hill. And so when Chamberlain sees the Confederates coming up the hill, he brings his men to attention. He brings them to carry arms, which is a marching salute. John Gordon is leading the first group up, and when he sees that the Union troops are saluting his men, he returns the salute with his saber. He's mounted, and then he turns around and does the same thing. He calls his men to carry arms. So you now have the Confederate troops saluting the Union troops. So you have both sides saluting each other.
Sure. Yeah.
And this is, as Chamberlain puts in his memoirs, it's honor answering honor. So when I talk to the 4th graders when they come here, You know, I asked, what were these men trying to do to each other 3 days earlier?
Yeah.
They go, they were trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
Now they're saluting each other. And so I said, if you ever become a veteran, this will mean more to you.
Right.
And so that's the good feeling that starts to come out of this surrender here. But then unfortunately, 2 days later, Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated.
Right.
And so some of that good feeling kind of dissipates.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think.
Does that give you enough?
Yeah, it does. I think. Well, before we get out of here, so in this home itself is not the original home, correct?
No.
And what I know there's a few pieces in here that are
The
from the
pieces
original.
that are original in here are the 2 vases on the mantelpiece. They came back in 1988 from a great-grandson of the McLeans.
Mhm.
And the sofa came back to us in 1954 from a granddaughter.
Okay.
And we do have, over in the courthouse, we have the original silent witness doll.
Yeah. Okay.
And we also have the original candlesticks. They belong to the park. And we have the original inkwell. That's on loan to us by the Sheridan descendants.
Okay.
That's in the lobby of the courthouse in the big glass case.
Great.
So.
Well, I think that about covers everything. I appreciate all your time,
welcome.
and that was very,
Yeah.
very helpful. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.